Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Agents to Owners podcast. With me today, I'm excited to sit down with this business consultant and financial analyst from Agency Focus, all the way from Lafayette, Louisiana, Mr. Colby Allen. Colby, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Brad. I'll just go ahead and jump and say you're the first one that I've had a podcast where you actually get to see my baby face. I've
Oh,
had a
really?
beard. I've had a beard for like 6, 7 months now. So I just shaved this week for my wife. And so I'm glad that you and I get to meet on these terms.
Oh, you must have had a big beard then, because you still got a little something going. You just got a little growth going on.
I did. It was about 6, 7 months long and my wife was not happy. So
Wow,
that was her Valentine's Day gift was me to shave. So
it looks good. I don't know what it looked like before, but it looks good now. I'm looking forward to getting into a number of things with you today. But won't you, for our audience, I know you've been on a couple podcasts, just tell us a little bit about your background and how you found your way to Agency Focus.
sure. So my name is Colby Allen. I am a consultant and financial analyst with Agency Focus, as you so well described, down in Louisiana, which is a beautiful and glorious state. Despite some other reputations you might hear across the nation. We just had Mardi Gras, which is what everybody knows us for. So we'll
Yeah,
go ahead and celebrate
yeah,
that. But
yeah.
now we're going into the season of Lent, which is a season of penance and fasting and all the other fun stuff. So
Okay.
yeah, background is I was a non-traditional student in college, like pretty much everybody else you'll meet. I fell into insurance, and 12 years later, still here. So I guess that tells you
Wow.
something. I've had a
Sticky.
lot of. It is sticky. I had a lot of jobs through college, and before that, I was a security guard at an art museum. I delivered beer, like all types of stuff. But insurance is what stuck, so that should tell you a lot. And but in school, I double majored and majored and minored in insurance and then
Mhm.
finance. Started as an internship in the finance department at a local agency, and grew from there. And my
Okay.
first experience was touching agency financials and compensation and a lot of things in that conversation. And then eventually worked my way onto a special projects team that handled M&A, book transfers, and revenue reconciliations for bringing over new teams. Those types of the 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 day two, as people call it, after you bring on a new agency, like the integration and contracts and what does that look like. So
Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
then fast forward to today. I've been with Agency Focus now for close to a year, and someone introduced me to Carrie in her show, and saw she had an opening. We ended up connecting, and almost a year later, here we are.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So what kinds of things are you doing it with Carrie at Agency Focus?
Sure. So everybody knows Carrie, right?
Yeah.
Everybody loves and knows Carrie. Our two core services are valuations and consulting or advisory for agency owners that are looking to either use a valuation for business planning and growth, and or if they're planning their exit to either retire, perpetuate to say a family member or an employee, or even prepare for an external sale. And so the valuation process is a big part of what we do,
Yeah.
and then consulting around that information. What do you do with it? Because it's good to know things, but it's not really meaningful unless you can actually set a plan to use that for your advantage. And then that leads into the financial consulting piece, which we act as a fractional CFO for agency owners to help them organize their financials, look at their processes and procedures for their financial operations. How do you set up reconciliations? How do you set up financial reporting? Because that's something that's huge for a lot of small businesses. Don't really have good, clean financial data.
Yeah.
So organizing and distilling those things to where they're easy and meaningful for owners to use. And then from there, there's a few derivative services that kind of fall into that bucket. We do a lot of compensation planning, compensation consulting, helping design producer plans, compensation studies to look at, what's your account manager compensation plan and does that compare to other agencies in your area or across the nation, et cetera. So compensation planning, producer contracts, anything to do with the financial operations or impact of the agency or things that we can help with.
Yeah. That's a lot. And that all those things are something that our industry or most businesses just in general need, right? I mean, we're specialists in our field.
Yeah.
We're not specialists in accounting or bookkeeping, tracking, whatever it is. So I was I decided to do a valuation with Carrie well over a year ago, and it was such an enlightening experience. Something I'd recommend for all agencies, really, because I'd recommend you having a perpetuation plan, and part of that is knowing what your business is worth.
Sure.
So that's a huge piece of it. I'm curious, when, let's say, somebody contacts you for CFO work, and I'd imagine that's going to be, a recommendation, that they perform a valuation. Do you see a lot of agencies that actually have that have a valuation in place, or even have a perpetuation plan in place? How many agencies would you gather, total guess, that have those two things in place?
Sure. So valuation, not often. And
Yeah.
then the second question of, having a perpetuation plan, it's funny because in our intake process, when we start a valuation service with an agency, one of our questions is, do you have a formal perpetuation plan?
Hmm.
Probably 9 out of 10 times. Somebody's going to say,
Right.
I've got an informal or a plan that's not written,
Yeah.
but it's not formal. And so I'm like, okay, well then that's a risk factor.
Yeah.
And so to answer your question, yes, there are some that have a very clear vision of what they want to happen with their agency.
Yeah.
They've either got a buy-sell agreement with a partner, or possibly some planning with an employee or a family member, right? A child that's going to take over, or even an in-law, right? I listened to your episode with Taylor Garcia, which was
Yeah.
fantastic. And
Yeah.
he talked about, yeah, like his father-in-law brought him in as part of his transition plan. So yes, we do meet owners that have informal plans in place, and we help them, or try to help them, map out that plan. What does that look like? What do you want to happen, and how can you ensure that's going to happen in a smooth way?
Yeah. I want to focus on the bulk of this conversation on acquisitions, which there's so much talk in our space about acquisitions,
A lot of talk.
and a lot more talk than action probably. But so yeah, I think there's a lot that we can cover there. So let's just start. Let's just say that I want to get into an acquisition. I want to acquire another agency. I find out that ABC agency down the street is for sale.
Yep.
Where do I start? What do I approach them? What do I want to look at ABC agency to get that process going?
I would say probably an easy and quick way to get a deal done and figure out a few things is show up in their office with a briefcase full of cash and say, here you go. Have a nice vacation, right? No, not quite. Not
Yeah.
quite.
Yeah.
I mean, we would joke sometimes, if you ever want to buy an insurance agency, go to the local golf club, or golf course or country club, and you can find somebody that's ready to retire. But no, it is I mean, that's a great question, because a lot of people get so hyper focused on the dollars and their revenue that they kind of have the blinders on of the actual nuts and bolts of the agency that contribute or actually build up and support those dollars. People, processes, systems. It's a well-oiled machine that's moving in a direction that you need to understand. How is this moving? What are the components? What are the gears? What gears are really smooth and oiled versus what gears might be missing a couple teeth that need to be fixed or replaced. And then another way you can kind of look at that is also think about it in terms of investing. So when you go to buy a stock, there's different types of investors that people, they might look at a stock and its reputation and they just put money into the market and see what happens, versus people who deliberately pursue what's often called value investing. Like Warren Buffett is considered a value investor.
Yeah.
And what they do is they try to understand what are the different factors of this company that either add or maybe contribute risk to how it operates. So who's the leadership? What kind of
Yeah.
decisions do they make? What's the employee makeup look like? What are the systems in place? And so, like, real examples of that is oftentimes what we help owners do is set up what's called a buyer profile. And so really it's a good start to that process is doing evaluation yourself. So you can have a good map of who you are as an agency, the systems you have, your policies and procedures, and kind of get to know yourself. And then from there, see, okay, well, if I were to acquire agency, what does an ideal situation look like? And then how are ways that I can identify risk of integration into my own organization. And so that's going to look at, okay, first I'm going to ask, financials, good, clean historical data, agency management system data, if it's available. In most cases, it's not, but being able to validate what that owner claims through data
Right.
or certifications is huge. And so if they've got good data, that's great. If not, there are ways to figure out certain things, but really it's just like an underwriter that underwrites an account, right? They're going to ask questions. They're going to try to figure out, okay, you're telling me this about this company or this prospect, this insured. What information are you going to provide to validate what you're telling me? And
Yeah.
so
let's
sorry.
jump into a piece of that. Yeah, let's
Sure.
jump into the financials. I grab someone's P&L to start. What am I looking for?
First is going to be, what are the revenue sources? A lot of times you can have different ways to, how do they track revenue? Is it by department? Is it by line of business? Is it by carrier or market, right? There's a lot of ways that companies organize their statements. And so understanding how they recognize revenue, how they recognize expenses in different categories, and then really what's your bottom line. From there, you can see how's money coming in, how's money going out, and what's being retained or kept within the agency. A lot of times we also then take it one step further to see, okay, well, most cases, when you look at an agency on paper, they're probably not making a lot of money because they don't like Uncle Sam and they don't want to give him anything. And so
Yeah.
from there, you kind of have to back into, okay, what's a reasonable profitability for this agency? What are seller discretionary spending items that can be adjusted out or that are now at your disposal as an owner or a manager? And try to figure out what's the real profitability. But the first question is going to be, are their financials clean? Do they have a good chart of accounts? Do you know what transactions are being recorded where? And if not, you really got to figure it out.
Which, in my opinion, is why we should use a service like yours, because yes, I've come a ways in educating myself on a P&L and what to look for. I still need somebody that really knows this stuff. If I'm
Sure.
going to make this big investment, I need to know exactly what I'm looking at.
Which is
So
a good point, because also another thing in, say, like a due diligence process, you don't just look at the P&L, because that's likely a statement that's assembled by the transaction data, either by your bookkeeper, your CPA, whomever's handling your books.
yeah,
But how are you, back to that validation point, how are you validating that revenue? So from there, I'm not just looking at the P&L. I'm going to ask for, give me 12 months of all your carrier or your market commission statements. Because I want to see, right, this is what you record as revenue, but I want to see what's actually being credited to you as a producer or an agency from the carriers that you're working with. And so it's going to be another step to, like, again, validate or put some credibility on, okay, this is what you show as top line revenue. What is actually contributing to that via the commission statements and also probably bank deposits, like those types of things. So even if
yeah.
you have a piece of evidence, again, can you validate further what this person is saying about their company, so that you can have more assurance and reduce your risk of what you're actually trying to get?
Yeah. So moving on, next, which you mentioned, is their management system data. What should we look for? What should we look for there?
A few things. One is, probably in most cases, if you're, again, buying a legacy agency or an agency that's been around for a while, there's a good chance they probably don't have clean data, right? Part of my background, I actually was a data project manager for a large agency. And so even at that level, right, what is considered a best practice industry leading agency, we had a level of tolerance for data integrity. So if we said, okay, if we're 90% confident, 95% confident this is accurate, we're going to move forward. Versus if there's a level of uncertainty or integrity that you're not able to do a good analysis, that's something you want to look at closer. So, but to answer your question, so a lot of times in, say, like our valuation process, or when you're analyzing an agency, you want to figure out what are the important metrics and KPIs that I want to measure. Back to your own agency, does this measure up with what I have in a comparable way?
Yeah.
Or is there something here that I might need to look at closer?
Yeah.
And so total customer count, total policy count, what types of policies are written in lines of business, who are the markets, a lot of that type of data you want to be able to see. And if you don't see it, right, are there reasonable ways that either A, you're going to be able to manage it or figure out what's there so that you can have a good plan for either integration, migration, but also the inverse can be true. There may be ways that that agency is more efficient than yours or
Yeah.
have better policies around data
Right.
integrity. And so it's not just about the negatives or trying to identify risk, but also, figuring out, is there something here that I can learn? It's actually really common for a lot of owners, new owners that buy a new agency to take a 3, 6, 9, 12-month period of just learning,
Yeah.
spending time with that staff, spending time in their systems to see, okay, what are they doing? How are they doing it? Are there things that can be improved, but also are there things that I can learn to implement for everyone?
Yeah. I talk about the difficulty of, walking into an office that you're working with a buyer, that you're walking into an agency that you're, looking to purchase, and, they have paper files. And, how much more difficult is that to extract that type of information if there's limited information on an AMS, say, maybe they don't even have an AMS, but, um, how much is that? And is that something that maybe can be bought on a discount because of the difficulty of it?
So it depends. And like in those situations, so like, let me maybe ask you your perspective, like your opinion before I
Yeah.
jump into it. So
Yeah.
like if you met an agency that had, certain things in place that say you would consider as antiquated or maybe behind what your agency's doing, what are your thoughts? Like walking into that room of filing cabinets?
Yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, I've, I've been instructed, run from, something like that. But that sounds insane to me,
Mm,
to not be utilizing some form or as many forms as technology as you can, let alone just someone that is seeing the value in, and being paperless. It tells me now, which is really unfair. That doesn't mean that they don't track things. It doesn't mean that it's not a profitable agency. It
yep.
doesn't mean that they're not a solid producing agency.
Yep.
Um, it's just that it seems scary to me that they would be that behind the times, and I'm sure there's a ton of them out there.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good assessment.
Yeah,
Um, what I would offer though, maybe to add to it, I mean, you mentioned a couple of some positives that a lot of agencies that are in that situation have. So they're probably a good producer. They probably have a way to track certain things. It just may not be the exact same that you or like another owner is doing. And so the question is, when you're doing the due diligence process, so yes, certain forms of data provide validation or assurance that certain things are either risky or less risky. So that's kind of the question, just doing a risk assessment of what's there. And so it is very likely in some cases that agency is very profitable because in some ways I can understand the reasoning of an owner saying, I'm not investing in this technology because that's a cost and I'm already
yep.
profitable and this is working, right? If
This
it's
is the way
working,
we've done it for 50 years.
yep,
So, why would I change it? And it could be, their bookkeeping could be, uh, you know, it could be just spotless. I mean, you don't know.
yeah.
Yeah.
Also, too, and I'll throw out a contrarian point. Okay. So there are also the inverse of a lot of agencies that do invest in technology, but if you don't utilize it,
Correct.
you can actually find yourself in some sticky situations too, to where your expenses might be higher, right? There's a little
Yeah.
bit of wisdom in that prior owner that says, like, I'm not gonna spend this money or this expense if I know my staff's not going to use it. We're already profitable, et
Yeah.
cetera. So like there's some rationalizations,
Yep.
but to kind of get to your question, it's we're trying to do a risk assessment of what is going to give you more assurance in what you're buying versus things that you have as unknowns and that you're going to have to factor in, like you asked, a discount. When you look at pricing on anything, it's again no different than underwriting for an insurance policy. That underwriter is asking the questions of, it's really funny. There's like this inverse relationship. Agents want, or insurers want, cheap policies to sell with the least amount of questions possible. Because you're trying to get to that quick sale. You're trying to make that thing
Yeah.
transactional to get on the books and get to servicing. And what the underwriter's perspective is, well, the more information you provide, the more I can understand the risk
Yeah.
and the more I can better tailor this service to this insured. And so there is kind of an inverse relationship. But the reason you do due diligence is to try to reduce your risk and uncertainty of what you're actually getting.
Yeah.
So if something is paper versus digital data, you can still validate things. It's just not going to be as fast. It's not going to be as efficient. It's not going to be as easy. So that's kind of the trade-off.
Yeah. What sort of things should we look out for? What might be some red flags?
Probably one of the biggest ones is going to be if an owner's not cooperative with you asking those questions. I do see it quite often where people are ready to sell, they're ready to retire, they're ready to have an exit, whatever the reasoning is. And then when you start asking all those questions to provide information, they're like, well, why are you asking for that? I'm like, well, I'm trying to understand what I'm buying, right? And so seen many cases where, somebody's trying to acquire an agency, they're trying to perpetuate, they're trying to transition, whatever that looks like. And then you start asking for the financials. You might ask for agency management system data. You might ask for commission statements. You might ask for an employee roster. You can ask for a lot of things. And if either A, they don't have it, or B, they might have it, but they don't want to give it to you, it's hard to validate. And so if someone's uncooperative, you can probably have some assumptions as to how they manage the agency, but yeah, not being able to validate information that they're claiming is a red flag. I'll say that. That's one of the biggest ones.
Yeah.
Another one is maybe to be more specific, right? We talked about like employees, or we'll probably get into staffing in a little bit.
Yeah.
But if like one thing we look at is employee tenure. So give us an employee roster with titles, with what their compensation plan is, their tenure with the agency, how long they've been there. And also we ask questions around your turnover for the last 1 or 2 years. And is staff turnover risk? Because if you're trying to retain employees, but them as an agency have not had good staff retention, that could be an indication that something internally might be problematic. Could be things that you can improve, but that's something you need to be aware of, is if they've had a lot of staff turnover.
Yeah. Let's get into that. One, what are some best practices for us to, kind of vet these employees, because we don't want to take over someone's, we don't want to take over a problem. I suppose it depends on our situation. We're probably going to need help with this new acquired business. But so what are some common things? I mean, is it common, for us to go in and meet with the employees and, have upfront conversations? Is that something that happens, very often, or?
Probably not as often as what is recommended, but yes, I would say at some point it is in your interest to try to meet with those employees or have a good assessment of who they are and what they do. Also kind of throw out there as a kind of a, not a warning sign, but like something to be aware of. Many owners or potential owners, they look at a transaction, again, focusing on the dollars, focusing on like performance metrics, and not forget, but don't really apply human, centered empathy for the people.
Right.
And so first, connecting with them as people is huge, because if people don't, know that you care, they don't care what you know.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, connecting with them on a personal level is probably huge. It's huge. It's monumental. And so from there, once you actually make a connection, right, if you can actually have a good interaction with them to get to know them, learn who they are, learn about their families, right? Just get to know them as people, because you probably do the same thing with your staff.
Yeah.
And so from there, if say the owner doesn't do certain things or track performance, or have a history of performance reviews, I actually share something weird about myself.
Yeah.
Every organization I've been to, you have your annual review that you do. I've actually always printed a copy and kept that for my own records of what are the questions that my employer asked for my performance, like what have we done, what are the goals we set, and then what was their assessment of my performance. And not everybody does that, but for you to be able to have a history of that, to show like, okay, I know I've had this relationship with my employer, this is what we agreed on, this is what we did, and this is what we're trying to do or accomplish together, is huge, because you want to know as a potential new owner, what's that person's track record or performance. And so that might be a question to ask for that owner. Hey, do you do performance assessments? Do you have copies of that? Right? Like, what do you do to manage your employees' relationship and performance?
That's a good one.
So if they have those records, that's fantastic. If not, there might be other things you can do, like Colby assessments or some type of personality or skills assessments that are pretty easy.
Yeah.
It's almost kind of leery though. Like the first thing you do when you step in and say, "Hey, can you do this performance assessment?"
Correct.
So it's
Right.
kind of scary, but like once you get to know them and actually have some assurances in the processes and learning, there are ways to learn about people's skills and their expertise without, I guess being overly scary. I'll say that.
There's going to be situations where you analyze someone's data, financial data, and you see that maybe their payroll expense, their benchmark is way higher than what it should be.
Yep.
And so, there's just so many layers to all of this. And so, maybe by doing some of that due diligence, that you can't keep all these staff. You're gonna have to let someone go. That's pretty tough for a new owner to come in, but you must run into this, all the time. And now that I'm thinking, I bet you spend a fair amount of time as mediator, counselor, because it's such an emotional, especially for a seller, it can be such an emotional transaction.
Yeah, it is.
So,
yeah. I mean, because you said it in a couple of different ways. And if you ask any business owner, any entrepreneur, any CEO of a company, a lot of times they're in business to make money, but usually there's other purpose or mission behind why they're doing what they're doing. And if you ask somebody, Carrie says this a lot and it's so true, but if you ask owners, like if you had to prioritize the top 3 things through selling your agency, what do you want, or what do you list as the most important? And usually it's, I want someone to take care of my employees. I want someone to take care of our clients. And then, what's the price, right?
Yeah.
What can actually get through this process? Some owners are the inverse. They say, I want to get top dollar and I don't care what happens after that. But if you ask most owners, like, what do you value through this process? Usually it's, I want my people to be taken care of, because that's why you're in business, right? You're providing jobs, you're providing value to a lot of people in your community that probably treat as family. There's a lot of things that go into that. And so for that to be disrupted, it's hard. For that to be shaken, it's hard because you take it personal. And so, there can be, to your question, there can be some situations to where there's an inverse relationship in how you care for your employees versus how someone else would care for your employees. That's often seen through compensation plans. That's often seen through a change in benefits, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. But those are things you need to be aware of. And I've seen some stories where owners step in and say, as a selling point, hey, you don't offer benefits. I do. And so your staff are going to get, going to get a good health plan, right? I offer a retirement plan that they can start contributing to and that I'm going to contribute to, right? It's not always the inverse of like, hey, I'm just going to slash things, but it's really trying to analyze and figure out, okay, what's available? How are we going to do this going forward? And how can we manage this well for everyone? But we'll jump to kind of a brash question, right? Producer compensation is massive.
Yes.
It's huge.
Yeah, which I had good transition. That has to be a major component to a lot of these sales, right? And if I walk into an agency and I feel that someone has a higher, maybe way too high compensation package to a producer, talk about the, how that's handled oftentimes. And then 2, what legally happens to those existing contracts? Are those just null and void with the sale? How does that generally work?
Can I ask?
And there's it's
sure.
Probably not easy because there's all different compensation packages, right? So
actually part of my background is I worked on producer validation, like data management and helping owners have the data around their producer comp plans. A former agency that I worked for had multiple compensation plans for producers based on what they were doing. So yes, to answer your question, there's a million options as to how you can pay producers. But before I jump into it, maybe ask you a prereq. You don't have to give any details or answer how you
Yeah.
want. But whenever you were starting your agency and you have your producer agreements, I guess what guidance or what sources of information did you have to set up like what you set up in your agency?
Yeah, a little bit different. And I've always been fairly candid with this. So I started working in this agency and before I bought it out in 2011.
Okay.
So there was already some existing comp plans. Now when I took over, I knew nothing
Mm,
about comp plans. One of the attractive um, pieces to me of joining this agency was the favorable comp plan because it basically favored the independent agents, right? And or the producer, and it did, and it does. Well, now that's an issue that I'm
mm,
dealing with, or when I go to sell, because I haven't disrupted those
mm.
plans, for those. Now, for other producers that I've taken on, I've adjusted some of those plans, or I've really just made employee producers is really how I've handled that.
Yep.
But quite frankly, that's a problem for me
Mm,
because it affected my valuation because basically it's my comp plan is way too high, and that but I
yep.
understand that going into when I do go to sell, because basically those comp plans are basically taken out altogether, which is that's just what it is and what I'm dealing with.
Sure.
So I don't know how, and I'm not looking to sell anytime real soon. But if somebody were to come in and purchase somebody, I mean, that has this different kind of unique plan, I don't know how their comp plan would have to be adjusted if you were going to keep, some of our producers. So I'm really curious what that looks like and how that's handled in different situations. I know it's not uncommon. I've heard of
Yep.
it. I've heard of it from Carrie, and yeah.
So
So
oftentimes when I have this conversation with owners, the first question or one of the first questions we start with is what agency model do you want to use? What
yeah.
agency model do you have? And does that align with your exit strategy? And so
Mm,
oftentimes, I'm actually going to try to write a book on this just because it's so complex and
okay.
a lot of people do this stuff, but they don't really know what they're doing until they're actually in it. Kind of like your situation, right? You bought
Yeah.
something, didn't really know what you have, and now that you're trying to
No.
have an exit strategy, it's contrary to what you have.
Which is going just to touch on my situation a little bit. So that's the only, acquisition I've ever made, if you want to call it that. I
Mhm.
had no idea what I was doing. I had no
Mhm.
idea what I was looking at. We had no idea how to value the business.
Yep.
We each thought that we didn't get such a great deal, which might mean that it was kind of a fair deal.
Sure.
Um, but I also knew what I was buying. But I bought the agency with these existing contracts. I could have had producers leave, but I paid full price for it.
Yep.
I essentially bought out their book of business when they, could have taken it. And so it could have got real messy. It didn't,
Yep.
but it's a big risk
Yep.
that, again, I wasn't prepared, educated to buy out an agency, but I
So
did
this,
anyway.
yeah, I mean, that's great. And to kind of maybe dive into that a little bit, oftentimes what we find or what I find when working with agencies is there's a bunch of different models, okay? But they kind of all distill down to what are two kind of basic models. One is going to be a standard independent agency. You hire employees and they sell, they service, and in a way you own the book of business, or there might be definitions around producer ownership, whatever that looks like. Contrary to what is a master agency model, okay? So where an agency pseudo tries to build a organization around other people selling for them that aren't necessarily employees, okay? And so I use the term master agency because that is the model and the terminology used for, say, like aggregators
Right.
or alliances. Even the technicalities is so the master agency, won't use any names, but there's a couple out there that a lot of people are members of. And the way that's set up is the carrier recognizes them as, say, the master agency, and then they hire or contract out sub producers to sell on their behalf. but they aggregate the premium. Okay.
Yes.
Different ways to handle it. But the reason that the commission splits are inverse is because in most cases, those are usually established agencies, and they're using the aggregator, the alliance, whatever, to access carrier contracts, member benefits, whatever. And then they put a value on those benefits through the commission split to cover their overhead expenses, to cover their margin, their staffing, and their member benefits to distribute. And so whenever a independent agency tries to mimic a master agency model without a good producer contract, you might find yourself in the situation that you're in.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Yep. So essentially what you have is a model like an SIAA or a CAA, right?
Yeah.
You've aggregated a lot of sub-producing agencies, and unless your contract is very dialed in to what you're trying to accomplish, when you go to sell, you can't sell like a normal independent agency because that's not what you have.
Right.
And so one thing that we work with a lot of agencies on is try to figure out, okay, what agency model do you want to have? How do you set up a contract with your producers to accomplish that? And that's going to come into definitions around compensation, around what is ownership defined as, because that's another ambiguous thing that a lot of people just throw out is producer ownership. Okay, well, that can mean 50 different things. How do you define it? Do you have the rights to the expirations so that you can leave if you want to? Does that mean you have a right to a financial value based on a specific timestamp, right, of your book of business? Right. Defining ownership is huge because a lot of people don't do that well. But kind of circling back to your specific question.
Yeah.
A new owner steps in. How does that contract respond? Well, I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah. Right.
But it depends. It depends. There's a lot of state law that dictates contract rules and precedent. There's some federal law that defines contract rules and precedent, but it really just is down to the terms that are in that contract. A few very specific ways to maybe flesh that out. It's a really good practice, and a lot of owners do this, but usually when the contract is written, it is between the agency and the producer. Okay. So it's not that the producer is, contracted with you, Brad Bolt, as the owner. It's they are contracted with your agency.
Right.
And so there is a little bit of definition to allow for, say, ownership change, to where if a new owner steps in, it's not that they were strictly contracted with you as Brad and they're not contracted with this new owner, but they're contracted with the agency. And so unless there are terms or triggering events that define how that contract responds to a change in ownership, in many cases, that contract can be perpetuated through new ownership. And so a new owner might be assuming that contract and those terms with those producers, unless there are terms that dictate they can change it. So you might also see, right, one step down where there's a term that says this contract can be amended or changed with X days notice in writing by either party, right? Whatever that looks like. But unless there's a term that says, hey, if a new owner steps in, this contract is null and void, a lot of times it's perpetuated based on whatever the precedent is. So that's kind of the key advice, or the key takeaway is having a good producer agreement is paramount. It's paramount.
Right.
Because a lot of people focus on commission rates and a very ambiguous definition of ownership. But the more precise you can have that agreement and expectations,
the
better. Because then you know what you're buying, right?
Right. I'd imagine this is a main reason why deals might fall apart. Or you're doing it's if the compensation agreement's too rich, it's not something you can change, that you're handcuffed to, because in a lot of cases, if it is too high, pretty difficult to be profitable.
Yep. Yeah. Many times producer compensation is the biggest thing on your P&L. And so very common for you to hear stories of an agency selling to, say, like a private equity agency or a larger national agency. And the first thing they do is put a crosshair on the producer comp plan. That's often because that is the biggest item that gets adjusted. That's usually also a competitive advantage or sell between smaller private agencies and national agencies, right? We pay our producers 40%. We pay our producers 50%. Those national agencies pay them 25%, 30%, right? It's much less. Well, they don't ever actually look into the details of what actually built up that comp plan. It's usually just about the commission rates. But again, if you sell to another agency that has a different plan for compensation, and that could be possibly changed, there's a lot of ways that can go down. So not uncommon for producers to leave and find another agency that'll pay them the same rate, if not different. What isn't unspoken of, and I'll give you an example of something that happens with some larger agencies. Say, for example, producer comp plan, if they get, say, 35% on renewal, the new agency only pays 30% or 25%. You hear many cases of owners having retention clauses to stay on through transition to help with retention. But there are some cases where, say, if a producer comp plan is changed, it's not instantaneous that the producer just gets a cut in pay. There can be also a trickle-down effect of, hey, we're going to change your comp plan because this is our structure, this is our staffing model, this is why this is in place. We are going to offer you, say, a one-time bonus or a promissory note. We will pay you the difference of your renewal commissions for 1 year, 18 months, whatever that looks like, in order to stay on for 1 or 2 years to help through transition. And so producers in many cases are also taken care of, right? If you plan it well enough. It's not that you just instantly get a cut in pay. Because that agency owner has a vested interest in that producer staying because they have the relationship with those clients, right? They've generated that business. And so while a comp plan can change, there are ways to, either mitigate that or try to have a mutual agreement through a transition.
Talk a little bit about, maybe the difference between, an owner staying on for a period of time to, retain the business, to, retain the, the agency as on a whole, keep your staff, keep everybody happy, versus I just sell and I'm out. Is the staying on and keeping the keeping the business afloat, is that typically a little more lucrative, would you say?
In most cases, that from what we've seen, that's been kind of the trend in a lot of deals, strictly because people want assurances and the market value of agencies has been increasing. So if people are paying more, they want reduced risk, right?
Yeah.
That's
Right.
the view, right? You pay more, you pay a premium, you want to reduce your risk. Because how many people do you meet that, find some really risky investment and they're willing to pay a premium just to get in?
Right.
It happens.
Right.
But in a lot of times it's not an ideal situation. But it really does depend, because there are many situations that the owner is the key producer. And so it is, perfectly good sense to help them through a transition period. And then there are some cases where the owner is, say, not a producing staff member.
Yeah.
And they do have a really good system of staff that is in production, is fostering that growth. And so if there are ways that the agency can grow without you being present, that's a premium factor. And that's another reason too why we do evaluation process and do a risk analysis. How is this agency operating? What are the dependencies? What are the things that keep it moving forward? And how do you lay that out and put a value to it?
Yeah. Something I've been working on is, and it's essentially, Ron, but essentially my business, I won't say it runs without me, but I am not involved in the day-to-day operation anymore. So I'm trying to establish a system for everything.
Yeah.
And we've been working on that for a couple of years, but and I've been literally training my team to not depend on me. I haven't been answering all these questions and getting them in the mindset of this engine needs to run. Sure. without me being involved. And so that's what I've just been focusing on, making a system, and refining our processes, cleaning everything up. And so if something does happen to me, someone else can step in and run it, or and to be more attractive for sale, to be quite honest.
Sure.
So And it's a lot. It's work. It's work. I enjoy it though. I enjoy the training and the processes and fine tuning and tweaking, and that's fun to me. So, um, talk about all the ways that agency focus can help in an acquisition process.
Sure. So I will clarify to start, we do not act as a broker. A
Right.
lot of people think, or they might ask us, hey, can you help me find a deal? So we don't do that as a service. We are a fee-based advisor to where we either from a buyer's perspective or seller's perspective will come on as a consultant to help you figure out the process, to do the due diligence yourself and lay out the information and make a more informed decision. So whether we're hired by the seller, whether we're hired by a potential buyer, we help them analyze the different components of what the process looks like for them and potentially negotiate right with the other party. Some cases we can be hired as they say like a mediator, but we'll be hired by both parties to do like an assessment to provide for one or the other under NDA or certain confidential information that's not disclosed. That's just part of a due diligence process. But we get hired as a fee-based advisor. Most cases to do a valuation, provide a general risk assessment, and then from there, an owner can determine if they want to hire us to continue in the due diligence process and the negotiation process, or if they want to take it from there.
Yeah. Okay. And then before we jump off, let's just touch on pivot a little bit because I'm curious about it to um, the 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 fractional CFO work that you guys
Sure.
do. So tell me a little bit about what that all entails. If you're going to come into my agency,
Yep.
how can you help from a fractional CFO perspective?
Sure. I'll also start the same by saying what we don't do. So we are not a bookkeeping service. We are not a
Right.
transactional bookkeeper. So we act in the capacity of a strategic advisor and consultant on what you have and how you can use it. So we do have partners that we work with that do transactional bookkeeping. And if you work with us, right, if you're not happy with your bookkeeper, we can recommend them and they're actually part of our process and help us a lot. But we start with an onboarding process. And that includes kind of similar to evaluation. We're going to gather data around the agency, historical financials. We're going to get a lot of operational data. We're going to get a list of your employees. We're going to get a questionnaire that highlights a lot of different operational questions about the agency, get to know you as the owner, and then really kind of step into a capacity of, say, if you had a full-time CFO or full-time controller, that person is a component of your business that's very integral into what you do and
Yeah.
how you do it. So we try to take that value and scale it down in a fractional way to where we're not necessarily an employee of your company, but we want to know all the important metrics, all the important components that we need to help you figure out how to make informed decisions. And so that starts with an onboarding process of we do a full workup and analysis of your historical performance, looking at your accounting practices, your chart of accounts, right? How do you actually have financial data available? Is this going to accomplish what we want? If not, we then go into, well, we go into anyway, goal setting, figuring out what's important to you, what do you want to accomplish, and how we're going to measure it and set a plan to make that happen. So whether you're an owner that you're trying to grow, okay, how do we use our resources to grow?
Yep.
If you're an owner that wants to maximize profit and cash out, how do we do that in a way that's efficient and also ethical, right? Trying to figure out what are the ways that we can actually figure out what your goals are and make that happen. And so, because the same thing is right, it's not my business, it's your business. And my
Yeah.
goal as an advisor is to figure out, okay, what is the reasonable means to figure out what information is available and how you can use that information to make informed decisions. So, like a CFO is going to use an agency's financial resources to guide strategically the investments and the capital of the company to accomplish the goals of the company. So we figure out what are those components. You've got people, you've got processes, you've got systems, you got these different buckets of investments you can make. How do you allocate your capital to get the return that you want? So
Yeah.
kind of back to my early analogy, right? When you've got a public company, right? You can follow their stock price on the market because you can log into Yahoo Finance, type in their stock ticker, and you figure out what they're doing that day. A CFO, in a way, right? We do a valuation, we figure out what the components are, The reason it's good to get a valuation done on a routine basis is to figure out, okay, what's the market value of my company today? Does that align with my exit plan? If yes, great, let's keep on this track. If not, what are the different levers or changes I can make to get my company's price from where I want or where it is today to where I need it? And that's our goal as a CFO and an advisor, to help you figure out, okay, what's your plan? What's your exit plan? Where are we today? How do we get to where we're trying to go?
Yeah. Wow, I like it. And like I mentioned earlier, just a huge need for in our space for that, because we don't have that expertise. And it just helps to have someone else looking at it from a different angle.
Yep.
Or we don't do. So it's that's super helpful.
And also too,
Colby,
it's specialty. It's leaning into your expertise. It's really investing your resources where they're efficient. So like, I'll fully admit, I've got a producer's license. I've got some acumen in sales. I did sales in college, right? I know what the sales process is. I'm not an insurance producer. And
yeah,
so if that's what your skills are as an owner, my job is to enable you to do those things well. The inverse is true. I can read financials like nobody's business, right?
Mhm.
Give me a P&L and a balance sheet, and I can probably tell you everything you need to know about the company, or at least a lot about what you need to know
Yeah,
about the company. And so that's what my job is to take those, what seem as complex things, and make it super easy for you to
yeah,
use.
yeah, and provide some clarity. Yeah. Colby, if people want to get in touch with you, talk about any of these things, what's the best way for someone to reach out to you?
So you can either email me directly. That's Colby, Colby, at agency-focus.com. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. You can connect with me there, send me a message, or you can go to our website, agency-focus.com, look at our contact page, and there's options there to schedule with myself or Carrie.
Yeah, and you put out a lot of good content on LinkedIn, because I was checking that out. So yeah, definitely give Colby a follow on LinkedIn.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time today. This was super helpful. Hopefully it helped some other agents out there. Everyone else, thank you for listening to another episode of the Agents to Owners podcast. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Brad.